Good evening, everyone. It was a number of months ago that I had the pleasure to meet Kenneth. I think that this was a moment where I think we had a discussion around the qualities of being, not just at the AA, but in London before you departed for the United States, that this could be a place where the incidental conversation could occur. I'm delighted to have met you this evening also in the bar with Petar and Snežana, to kind of reignite this idea that one can have a conversation that has a fluidity, that has depth, can explore ideas, and that those ideas are then something that are shared with the student community and perhaps also with the wider community. And this is a place we can again come together and reflect on the things that have been important within architectural education, but also challenge those as we move forward. It's with particular pleasure that I can introduce Petar and Snežana, who are coming to us from Serbia via all over the world. They've not long ago, but fairly recently, launched this fantastic journal, which begins to open questions through a tremendously erudite number of writers and contributors, this question of architecture and philosophy. Petar, the philosopher, Snežana, the architect. Both professors. So this is a kind of a wonderful combination that can begin to bring and question these ideas. Obviously, it was that incidental conversation that you had, I believe, over breakfast in the US with Kenneth that enabled you to come here and be introduced to me and to the school. This evening is a wonderful opportunity to bring a few more voices to the table. Petar, who's I think a long-time friend of Kenneth's, newly introduced to the two of you, and Eric Perry, if he'd also like to join us at the table in a moment, who is both, I call you primarily an architect, but you can dabble in some philosophy. and then, of course, Kenneth Frampton. I think that Kenneth's work was seminal in my education. I think that the ideas that you've been exploring, not just when you were here in the UK, but even when you left us to go to the US, have been critical to the way in which we've challenged ideas of architecture and theory, the relevance of philosophy within this context. It's a wonderful opportunity to come together around this table to talk about some of the content of the journal and to begin to probe some of these very challenging questions. So if I can invite Professor Kenneth Frampton, Petar and Snežana, I'm afraid I would butcher your surname, so I'm being very shy there. Petar and Eric Perry, if you'd like to join us at the table.
In the last 2 hours or so, I've been reading or trying to catch up with what's in I believe it's the second issue of the magazine. I always thought it was the first. And particularly, what is rather amazing, I think, about almost all of the contributions to this first or second issue of the magazine, is how topical it is in a way, because I think one author after another introduces, the problem of it. What is the nature of the and which term should come first? For example, should it be, philosophy and architecture, or should it be architecture and philosophy? That can also occupy quite a lot of discussion, I think. And but there are amazing texts, in particular a text by Andrew Benjamin on Agamben's critique of Heidegger's concept of building-dwelling thinking, which, this question of the good life and the possibility of the humans to lead a good life, and what does that mean, etc., etc. This is, it's not adequate by any means, but this is the gist, I think, of Benjamin's reading of the relationship between Agamben and Heidegger, for example. And I think it is, there is a kind of topicality to many of the contributions to this issue. Catherine Ingram sort of introduces another voice who's not directly present, but one who challenges, again, what do we mean by the good life, and who is going to have a good life in relation to late capitalism, etc., and also in relation to colonialism, for that matter. And so it's not, obviously it's not a magazine about politics, but strangely enough, I think politics and the current aggravated state of things, particularly in the Middle East, is sort of, it's oddly topical. It didn't intend to be topical, obviously not, but my reading of it, in any case, I think of it as being somewhat topical. And I should perhaps also say, how is it what am I doing here? The famous Bruce Chatwin question. Yes, well, I suppose I've kind of flirted with philosophy one way or another for quite some time. And someone who is very close to the people sitting on either side of me, no longer alive, is a Czech architect, philosopher, Dalibor Vesely. And so Vesely, I was never a pupil of Vesely. It was always a kind of accidental meeting, either in New York or in London, over quite a long period of time. And but I'm very proud of the fact that, although I think I've now lost it, which is not something to be proud of, is that at some point Vesely gave me his copy of Gadamer's Truth and Method, and I've always been attracted by the issues raised by phenomenology, largely because I think my reading of it is relevant to architecture in as much as it specifically addresses the experience of the subject in relation to the environment, and above all, not only the visual experience of the subject in relation to the environment, but also all the other senses as well. And sound, of course, and above all, of course, it can be summed up, I suppose, in contrasting the visual, which tends to be always emphasized, to the tactile, and it is the question of the tactile that I think is really has been and still is of great importance to the creation of architecture, And so this issue of the phenomenological and tactile is something that I'm still very preoccupied with. And I realize if I'm ever going to do anything more with it, I'm going to have to sit down and sort of really address myself to Merleau-Ponty, I think, Maurice Merleau-Ponty. Above all, in my case, what attracts me about Merleau-Ponty is the double aspect that he was both a philosophical figure, of course, above all, but also a political figure. And the split between himself and Jean-Paul Sartre, for example, very soon after the end of the Second World War, when they jointly edited the magazine Les Temps Modernes. I mean, this is... what is fascinating is, of course, Merleau-Ponty's Marxism in relation to phenomenology. I mean, the one thing probably that Dalibor would never, of course, even bothered to address. For him, it would be an anathema, the idea that there could be any kind of connection between them. But for me, there remains this connection. So this rambling kind of quasi-introduction is coming to an end, and I will pass.
Thank you very much, Ingrid and Kenneth, first of all, for hospitality. We are also hospitality, how to say, we are using hospitality protocol because journal as such is some kind of mix of voices, mix of people, mix of ideas, concepts, etc. And as you see here, we try to mobilize architectural departments, but plus philosophy departments. It's more difficult with philosophy departments to mobilize and to propose some ideas about relations between architecture and philosophy. Well, that's the first problem. I'm architect. Snežana is philosopher. You see, I'm philosopher. Snežana is architect. She's doing something about concept, architectural concept, because generally concept is philosophical. Yeah? I'm trying to do something about project, and well, that's first. Second is this. If we check what AA bookshop has in there in philosophy shelves, we will see that they are generally French philosophy. Okay, this is second moment because I was studying with Jacques Derrida, who, as you know, who was very engaged in architecture in one period of his life with several architects, and he always started his speech to say that he doesn't know nothing about architecture. This is also my position. I don't know nothing about this, but I'm trying to. I'm working first of all with Snežana, who is practitioner. I don't care with theoreticians, because I'd like to I'm trying to be in philosophy practitioner, not just. That's why I'm in position to work with the others, not just architects, of course, but then. We are talking several days. We are trying to understand our position because, as you saw here, we have all, or we will have all important thinkers of architecture in these numbers. We will have beside Kenneth. Beside Peter Eisenman, Čume will be with his interview in next number. We have, we are trying to collect all positions, all possible positions between architecture and philosophy. This is first. Then to try differentiate why philosophy, and not thinking or theory or critical thinking and architecture, etc. We had some thoughts about why it's important. Okay, first of all, there is no such kind of journal. It was architecture and philosophy. Philosophy is probably, we have some kind of consensus that philosophy theory can produce, Snežana said, relations, but philosophy can produce novelty, new concepts, newses, for example. Principal idea is to to do something new. Well, that's why, and to help, not to help practitioners of architecture. That's the deal. Students, of course, but it will be brilliant if we will have presentation in some studios to understand old concepts, to push, for example, Kenneth to invent something new, or Petar to invent something new, because Snežana and him has conversation and they have agreement to make some kind of number of about E-N-D. For example, to change something. That's why the next number, Catherine Ingraham is a guest editor. The number will be about change. For example, and change or beauty with Paul Geyer, or microcosmos with Kenneth. These are very difficult concepts. How to think them and how to visualize them. Okay, this is practical. This is first idea to think, to visualize concepts, to invent new concepts, and to push the architects to thematize what they are doing. Well, probably like this we can say. Okay, next, this is academic journal. Why academic? Because if you have you have to what does it mean academic? Academic means that you have to support your ideas with ideas already done. That means I have to know what Kenneth thought about, I don't know, about the city, to do something new, to invent something new. That's why I think. For example, we talked with just several minutes before about construction of one interview, and we have an agreement. Then we have an agreement that interview must be, for example, in academic forms. It means answer questions. Academics. I think it's better to okay. There is no pictures here. Well, this is I think most important to find what was what we have in this theory or in these relations, in this in between architecture and philosophy, and then to push the philosophers and architects to think together. Think together is to produce something new, but not just new, to produce new objects. Well, this is now not just concept, not just project, but object. If we are not thinking together, if we are not producing something like this, for example, this is object. We are insisting on this. That's, we can say, that I'm talking about thinking together. In these presentations, we saw, first of all, as a philosopher, I saw that the presence of theory is very bad, and that's probably it's important to have to support the journal like this, or this critical thinking about the relations of architecture and philosophy.
Yes, actually, there is another magazine with exactly this title, Architecture and Philosophy, which partly, I'm not quite sure where it's produced. I mean, I think what is the extraordinary thing about this magazine is that it's coming out of Belgrade and it's produced in English, which probably for good reason, vis-a-vis, the universality of the English language. But Anyway, I think it's an amazing achievement, quite a daring achievement, in fact. I hope that I will be able to contribute something to future numbers of the magazine.
First of all, I must say that my approach to architecture is marked by the fact that I'm primarily architect practitioner. Also, I tried to do something in theory. I got my PhD on architecture concept. I'm now in the phase translating the book in English. Also, I teach at the Department of Architecture at Belgrade University, so I have design studio. Plus, with Petar, we have together a course Architectural Philosophy. It seems to me that dual position is very important in approach to our journal, because I always translate what I'm doing in my practice in my project and to theory, and to be able to have a critical approach to my practical work. I think that today the most important thing is that let's say, philosophy, architectural philosophy, not just a theory, comes from the architectural design and architectural project, and that theory today cannot be separately or additional moment to the practice or in teaching architectural student of architects. So we try to connect deeply architectural thinking in one project. I call that this journal project. Maybe it is in this moment object or just architectural concept. But I think that it is important for this status of architecture in this moment is to again open some topics from the history, but open new ideas and new concepts in architectural field. And plus, maybe it is the more important thing to talk together, philosophers and architects, is to have possibility for creation of new concepts, not just to talk about, but to work together and to be able to give something new, to be able to create together. So I think that is a starting position for this journal and for our team. Even we try to push more projects, not just this journal, but we last 6 years we have a summer school architecture and philosophy, plus we established a laboratory Perspect Lab at the Institute for Philosophy and Social Theory. But our aim is primarily to be able to discuss what is architecture now, what is the status of theory, and try to make new concepts.
This is a sort of charmed moment for me because Ken was my first teacher. We were in his seminar. We were assigned various texts, and I was given Giudolfo's Kitsch, which I managed to find the notes for the other day. And hopefully, people like Dalibor, Tony Vidler, and the wonderful Mark Cousins are looking down on us benignly. This business of architecture and words is something I too have been using my retirement to try to understand. Skipping over for the moment things like writing on buildings, except perhaps to notice that Islamic inscriptions weave in with the ornament much better than do Greek or Latin ones. And skipping over altogether Mayan hieroglyphic topographies, which I'm still trying to understand. It's in a completely different milieu. It is not representational in the sense that we're used to thinking. And along with that, architecture parlant and technical journals and so forth. I'm mostly interested in the phenomenon as it begins with Vitruvius, who attempts to weave architecture as a matter of general and practical knowledge through rhetoric aimed at decorum, based on the notions of civic virtue that people like Cicero advocated. Alberti, a millennium and a half later, derides Vitruvius's Latin and his Greek and attempts to situate making of buildings, in a humanistic culture which invokes the classical Christian reading that was part of all of life in particularly the northern Italian towns, and invoking the protocols of interpretation that we know from next door, Warburg, Saxel, and Panofsky, under the rubric of iconology. By the 1820s, Hegel had come up with in his aesthetics, had come up with a hierarchy, with architecture at the bottom, hierarchy of the arts. Architecture at the bottom, then sculpture, then painting, then music, and finally poetry, as being the closest to disclosing ideal beauty, the Geist, and so forth. This isn't too far off, actually, just without having to directly involve Hegel any further. Dalibor's spectrum between embodiment and articulation, which is inspired by Heidegger's Earth and World, which in turn is a reframing of Aristotle's physis and nomos, i.e. attempting to reach over Descartes' matter and mind, which incidentally is word for word in the prologue to Alberti, to find out a kind of more authentic version of the phenomenon. All of which raises, for me, the question that Ken raised of embodiment. Not so much what it's trying to do, which is to reconcile, the human imagination with the unforgiving universe, but how it operates, particularly in the context of culture which is full of ambivalent statements, duplicitous and even evil, and in the light of claims for, in quotes, intelligence coming from artifacts like large language models. In particular, there is a problem I call the romantic problem. I'm not sure that we have transcended the problem as it was confronted in Romanticism. Werner Hoffmann refers to it as a divided century, meaning it's about revolt and reconciliation. It's sacred and secular. It's art and science. You can see where this is going. If we put two kind of studio spaces together that attempt to work with this phenomenon, the Courbet Monatelier, which he calls a real allegory, the last 7 years of my life. And this problem of a real allegory is rooted in the secular sacred of Romanticism, how to confront life without a God. What kind of transcendence might there exist? Rooted in, everyday artifacts. Is that a private language or is it a common language? Blah. The correlate to this, at the time, there was an interesting debate between a guy named Planche, who, kind of misunderstanding what the Italian Renaissance was about, thought that all artists ought to be deeply involved in philosophy and reading and culture. Conversely, and he dubbed Courbet a realist, meaning he wasn't living up to the ideals that were represented in history painting or something like that. And the counter-argument took realism actually, instead of a disparagement, as a positive virtue, and said it is rooted in the inspiration of the artist. Okay, the reply to that is kind of 100 years later in Beuys's Das Kapital, Raum 1970-1977, i.e. explicitly referring to the Courbet studio. And it's, I don't know if you know it, just briefly, it's basically another installation with a piano with an axe lying against it, a projector with a screen, a tape recorder, and speakers, a bucket, some more fat and felt, and on the wall, depending on when it's exhibited and when it's exhibited several times. It's presently in the Hamburger Hof in Bahnhof in Berlin. About 50 blackboards that are full of text and diagrams and insights. And so this business of kind of a setting is a kind of Raum disclosing contingent meanings. And of course, Beuys created a real problem, particularly for Americans. And Americans were more orthodox Marxists than a lot of their European counterparts. At any rate, they got really worried by Beuys because they couldn't figure out, they were expecting an artist to have kind of one motif that they really drilled down in. A kind of fragment, no artist at all, Jasper Johns. Or even Andy Warhol is usually seen to be the complement to Beuys. Operating, no artist at all, it's all just consumption. And they kept accusing him of, being a gadfly because he was involved in politics, he was involved in pedagogy, doing his installations and performances. And this, of course, is at a time when the problem of language was itself an art object or an object of exhibition. And I remember from the 60s, everything was wide open, much more so than it had been since. And all sorts of possibilities presented themselves. Architecture as critique, something like Superstudio and so forth. And this business of architecture and words was a much wider problem, though I'm not convinced, as I say, that it ever left. I mean, Beuys was accused of being a romantic by Buchloh. Whether or not you agree with Buchloh, that came from a famous little prank pulled by Petar, where he sent him a letter saying, basically, I'm Offenbach, who does it through entertainment, but the subversion is there, whereas you are Wagner, where you have a kind of system. And Buchloh took this seriously and ran with it and shat all over Beuys. Made it a real campaign. What's interesting to me is that in the recent turn away from form and space, with its emphasis on the optical and the noetic, probably to a certain extent out of guilt, that's whole farrago and the kind of journals where the museum and the gallery was highly suspect during this period, the writing wasn't, which came largely from the kind of authors that you're speaking of. And it ranged from, it wasn't simply books and buildings, because it was in the journals. It was, journals like October or whatever, the architectural equivalent, Assemblage, Log, whatever, any. As a constant recycling of the problem of, I would call it a representation problem. I'm very willing to be challenged on that. But what I do notice in the current context, and as I say, perhaps a guilt that this is all froth on a coffee that is exploitive of both people and resources, that there's a turn to practice, or praxis, as a kind of making do with available resources and in particular circumstances, which suppresses the emphasis on the noetic, on the conceptual. And perhaps it's not any longer a kind of narrative, a kind of world that demands the kind of words we've been playing with. And I don't have an answer to this so much as I think it's something I think about. I think it's interesting and important. Very good. It comes out of wondering what embodiment is. I think the phenomenologists have taken it for granted.
Well, embodiment can both be the subject and the object.
Yeah, as I say, it tends to be in the heritage of trying to adequate the human imagination with an indifferent universe, and so it manifests itself. I mean, Heidegger wants to get past the Cartesian matter and mind, but I'm not sure. And his own suspicion, his own instincts towards poetics and towards the pre-Socratics, is a way of trying to find a discourse that bypasses that.
Yeah.
And as I say, I wish you luck. If you get into the Mayan world, it's really helpful for scrambling all your assumptions concerning representation. Is to a certain extent that people like Bataille pointed the way, and Beuys himself was interested in this kind of milieu. On the other hand, the Western interpretation that tends to overemphasize the motif of sacrifice and erotics and sacrifice, it doesn't see it as part of a deeper metabolism of what got called being in the world. Is world separate from being? Wow.
Thank you. Ingrid suggested that as I was here, I come. So this is cold and fresh, and but at the same time, it is extraordinary to be sitting with all of you, but particularly Kenneth and Peter, of course, and thinking about Dalibor, because for me as a practitioner, I think the world of philosophy was framed by the idea of the city, and it was 8 completely wonderful 2-hour lectures that Kenneth gave at the RCA, with reference to Dalibor several times, that sent me on a trajectory, that landed me here briefly for a year, a wonderful year with Dalibor in his studio. And in a way, the teaching with Peter at Cambridge with the studio, and then following through into practice for a number of years, has always been couched in terms of the sense of one's presence in the city, in the kind of situated sense of what it is one's dealing with as a framework for streets, squares, buildings, sections, complexity. And I've always seen it as a kind of struggle with material, actually. Curiously, the orchestration of scale and city and thematics in urban space was absolutely, actually, although nothing to do with construction, it was everything to do with material in an incredibly tangible way. I think that that for me has been so there's a resonance of the philosophical and the political and the theatrical that plays its part in practice every day, actually, turning to the sense of the word, which was so incredibly important in terms of discussion, a continuous, very intense discourse about what it was one was doing. As student projects or certainly that richness actually has always seemed to me to be a defense in the world that I face every day as an architect, which is so much to do with being an arbitrator between the forces of development, the desire for development. I don't mean that just in a kind of mercantile way, but as a way of actually renewal, the sense of the renewal of the city. So I'm very happy to be kind of called the urban repairman. You know, it's fine. You know, but it would be impossible, I think, to be. I would find it impossible to be where I am without the richness of that thinking and speculation that was part of the studio in the School of Architecture. So, you know, I think, and that's a very visual thing. And obviously, this is part of the sustenance of that world. And so I just applaud it. Thank you.
Well, in a minute we will invite you all to contribute something, but I will sort of try to make certain figures sitting in the front row react. But in any case, before I do that, I was yes. I mean, one of the challenges that has sort of intervened in my being, so to speak, is this magazine, and is the two figures at either end of the table here, you know, architect and philosopher, and a project for a magazine on architecture and philosophy, and which two issues have already come into existence. And just now they asked me to choose a word for an issue of the magazine, to choose one word which would provoke a series of interventions by architects and philosophers. I mean, authors. The fact is, of course, I have to find the authors. And I think there might be an author, too, sitting at this table. That would be good if I can persuade them to play with the word. And so before protracting this too far, I mean, I thought, and I bring it up now as something that we could even discuss right now, here and now. The word I thought of was microcosmos, and the reason for choosing this word is that I think that you know, that the task of architecture at this moment in history is to create really small worlds in which the species can live out its existence, you know, live out its life in the best way possible. And of course, that small world could have quite different scales. I mean, it can, of course, obviously be a house, and surely it can also be a school. And which reminds me, by the way, of the extraordinary achievements that were recently made in Sao Paulo, where the municipality was able to design and realize, I mean, it puts to shame so-called first world countries, I think, was able to design and realize some 20, I think in the end 40 schools, which they positioned in the centers of the favelas on the periphery of the great sort of megalopolis of Sao Paulo, and thereby introducing into spontaneous housing a space of appearance and an institution which was supported at the national level also. I mean, so that it was both at one and the same time a school and a community center and a place which would also enable certain very impassioned people to eventually gain place in the national universities. And when you think that these favelas were without any core at all, and in the space of, 12 years, they were able to provide some 40 such institutions. This remains, I mean, quite outstanding and exceptional. And when one thinks of the action of European countries in this regard. I mean, I think Brazilians and particularly the Paulista have shown an exemplary capacity to do something about people's lives and to put them, of course, resources and power behind this kind of action. So that's what I have in mind, partly. I mean, to be as concrete as possible, what could a microcosmos be? You know, I think that, it's just a fact that they were able to achieve this and to transform the nature of life inside all these spontaneous housing settlements that, of course, had started already in the 60s, but went on, I think, for a good 20 or 30 years. Still going on, probably. And so that is my kind of shibboleth, magic word that may provoke, if I can find figures foolish enough to get involved with it, a series of contributions to this magazine. So I'm thinking about a possible future, but I would like perhaps to invite interventions from the floor. For instance, René.
Thank you. The first question that comes to my mind is why architecture and philosophy. Okay, we have an architect, we have a philosopher, that's one reason. But it could have been architecture and the humanities, it could have been architecture and so many other things. So that, I guess that's a question for you, which is, I sense at sometimes that there was a sense of urgency, that architecture was not properly built on concepts and that something needed to be done about this. So that's the first question. And the second thing that comes to my mind is, where does the impact of philosophy comes in architecture, and in particular whether it comes at the beginning, in the middle, or at the end? And you mentioned that connection with Derrida. Now, it always struck me that often in America, the relationship between architecture and philosophy comes at the end. For instance, in the exhibition of deconstruction, where suddenly we became aware that perhaps Derrida had something to do with it. But I often wonder whether there was an element of post-rationalization. But I don't want to make this into an argument, but the question does occur to me quite regularly, where and how philosophy comes into architecture. Perhaps in the magazine might be an answer.
One answer.
Why philosophy and architecture? Why not the other humanities or maybe art, etc.? I think, as an architect, practicing architect, I think that philosophy is the closest discipline to architecture, because it is directly connected to the question what I am doing when I do architecture. The other discipline you can also use, but I think that this is more productive in build new future for architects. Why not, for example, humanities or art or poetry maybe, because I think that in this relation also that relationship is always include, like thinking, what are you doing, what are you produce, what are you able to produce, and is precisely because it is not just addition, thinking additional as additional to the practice. to teaching or to thinking. It is directly connected when you are producing architecture, to use, to be able to mobile the thinking directly in process of production, not just to add as a additional value to the practice. The other thing which I think that it is important, I think that also philosophy can use architecture. For example, Petar is one of field of Petar's research or theory, or he wrote many books about institutions. And he also produces institutions. For example, this journal or laboratory or working together is some kind of institution. So philosophers can gauge their theories using architectural tools in the same time.
This is maybe Deleuzian. Why you said why not humanities, architecture and philosophy here? Philosophy is do you remember this definition of Deleuze? He's using the same word that's used. Urgency means that philosophy creates concept. Well, that's why philosophy probably is here in how to say, in closer to architect. Because I think that we can, in all architectural acts, we can find some kind of conceptual or concepts or conception in behind. Well, okay, it's a little bit difficult in English to say my concept is, or in French we are saying generally my conception. But for example, Corbusier, we can find when he was very young, he's repeating in one famous letter that he has a concept. Well, that's why I think that's why architecture is has some kind of advantage comparing to theory, thinking, humanities, etc. Here, the name of the journal is Khōrein. This is verb. Okay, this is also infected a little bit with this famous book, choral work, and these collaborations, probably unsuccessful collaborations, Derrida, Eisenman, but Chora or choral in that book is a name. Here we are using verb. Khōrein means to produce space, not to produce something, to do something, to find something, but not something, because chora functions in Plato as a third kind of being beside the ideas and copies. Well, that is a problem. That could be maybe one answer. I don't know. Probably not good answer. But philosophy, well, it's. I must say this because this is always. I'm repeating something, but on one moment in Harvard, Sarah Whiting asked all in auditorium who knows the book Choral Work, and we found just one hand. That means, Ingrid, you can do the same thing. I hope we will get the same answer, and probably, but that's why it's important to have a journal like this, I hope, and why we have this and why we are here, and why Kenneth insisted to do something here together.
You mentioned at the beginning of your presentation that you thought theory is bad. which I found quite confusing. What is your view about the use of theory in schools of architecture? And what is also your view about architectural history in establishing theoretical positions?
It is probably, we are here because this is very good moment for theory and architecture, or theory of architecture, because we have, last year we have several important books. We have in Graham book on theory. We have a Gleiter in German, Jörg Gleiter wrote the book about theory. Rambert in French, he wrote a book about theory. That means we have now present theory. Really, it's very difficult for me to talk about with Jörg Gleiter and Catherine Ingram. Why? First of all, they are theoreticians of architecture. I don't know nothing about architecture. This is first question, first moment. Second, sometimes I am. That's probably our collaboration could be maybe sometimes good. I have no inspiration to hear, to listen. Sometimes very imprecise thoughts. Architects or theoreticians of architecture are not how to say precise. Some of them, they have not philosophy training of philosophy, and they are using wrong terms, and well, that's why it's difficult for me to follow theoreticians of architecture. For example, this embodiment. When I hear this word, I have to stop. It's very difficult. I know, my teacher was phenomenologist. That means it's not this is the problem, but it's very difficult to understand, to use properly this word, to use properly this mechanism, because you have many authors, phenomenologists, and that's why we are insisting on philosophy, not on theory. Probably not. Tell me. Sorry.
I'm just thinking about this in context of the School of Architecture. So you're saying philosophy, not theory, or theory with philosophy. How would you bring philosophy into the School of Architecture now?
I must say one thing, that I really know what is the situation in all Europe schools, because I was in jury for Miss van der Rohe Award, Young Talent. So I in one moment, I saw last year all the projects, the best projects in the best European schools, more than 400 projects. And I must say that it looks to me that somehow it is empty space between theory and design project, because I saw that something missing. The second thing, what is important, we try to directly connect architectural thinking with the studio project, because we have, for example, at our faculty in Belgrade, we have together one course for the whole generation of master studies. It is more than 200 students. It is architectural philosophy. It is, I must apostrophize architectural philosophy, not just a theory, because we try to directly thematize what students thinking in architecture. The other theoretical subject which I'm working also on master studies is the individual methodology theory of the project. And also I try to directly work on with theoretical approach on students' project. But it is, results are different, of course, but I think that there is in this moment some gap between, let's say, contemporary theory, because that kind of theory which is now on the table somehow are past. And because of that, at the very beginning, I said what we need is creative part of theory, modern thinking, contemporary thinking, which is not historical thinking, which for me is good for analysis, for established relation, but doesn't construct, doesn't help us to know what is today, what is situation in the schools, in education. So I think that it is the good moment to speak about it, to have a dialogue between, when I say philosophers, I mean also anthropologists, artists, and etc. It is important not just to produce, because in school today it can be, technology is directly connected to the studio project, but we need new concept even in technologies and thinking to be able to be today in this, to catch reality in this moment.
I greatly appreciate this, the way the conversation is turning, because I think we are in a moment in which schools of architecture, or I'd like to put it another way. I mean, there was a certain moment in the States, but also universally, I think, in Switzerland and also in Germany, and here as well, where there was an emphasis on history theory. There were doctorates in history theory in major universities, particularly in Cambridge, I remember, and from the point of view of power, there has really been a shift in terms of, in terms of their attitude towards schools of architecture, because it's quite clear that, and they've been going in this direction for some time, but they're now, it seems to me it's manifest everywhere that the moment of history theory courses, with PhDs attached to these history theory courses, such as Peter, you were involved in Cambridge with Dalibor. I mean, this suddenly was eclipsed by the government, in fact, basically. So, if I remember correctly, Cambridge lost its possibility to do PhDs in this direction. And it was a very negative moment, but that moment is not over, I think. So I think the question about what is the relationship between history theory and philosophy is a very interesting issue and not so easy to talk about. I mean, I think in terms of my own attempt to address the question of what is the theoretical standpoint that one could convey to students, for example, arises with his book, Studies in Tectonic Culture of 1992. And I thought, contrary to my environment at that time, I mean the intellectual environment, that this emphasis on poetics of construction was an important thing to push towards. And I suppose that attempt did have some kind of philosophical ambition behind it, although it's difficult to say exactly, I would find it difficult to say exactly what that was. But when the term embodiment is used, I think, not only of the built form as an embodiment, but also the human being as an embodiment and the human being in relation to the built form, all of which I suppose is somewhat simplistic. But I think it's. I think it's right there. You know, this question of material, which Eric emphasized in a way. I think this question of material and the transformation of material, and architecture is fundamentally a material culture, but it can't be reduced to material. And I recently attended a presentation in the Barbican by a practice with the name Material Cultures, in fact. So with an enormous emphasis upon the need to develop more ecologically valid materials. But what was very odd in the presentation was there was no evident presence of the question of form. You know, so the whole issue of the well, you raised the issue yourself, René, right? You did. You know, this question of form, and I just think that this issue of form, of course, remains. It is a part of, it's indispensable in a way, the question of what form shall the work take.
Just quickly, in fact, our course was architecture and philosophy, so I'm very much on your side. The reaction against theory was that it tended to sort of have a happy ending in sight. And everything always worked out. And it was derived from the use of theory in particularly technology, about delivering results, rather than wondering about the nature of what it was and so forth. And there's this well-known distinction between ancient Greek theoria as a kind of witnessing as against post-17th century scientific theory. And because theory was a kind of standard rubric, I mean, there's definitely overlap. But at any rate, we opted for philosophy because it allowed us to work with a wider cultural spectrum. Now, what's happened more recently is a turn to anthropology and ethnography as a way of understanding architecture, particularly with respect to the kind of projects that you're talking about in Sao Paulo. And I think what Eric raises, the business of the city, it's no longer an argument, it's not a problem of form, it really is. And one of the reasons one's interested in, northern Italian root city republics, I mean, by the way, democracy is really the minor event in terms of human history. It really is very brief. And so when people do it properly and do it well, you really pay attention. Now you can say whether or not they did it well and so forth, I do. And I think the kind of example you were talking about in Sao Paulo is very much what I mean by a kind of topography of praxis. You can't kind of prejudge it. You have to work it out on the ground with the circumstances that are available. And I don't know whether it's a whole bunch of negotiations with material, with people, with, inadequate foundations, with inadequate hygiene, with gangs, with, can I get the supplies off the back of a lorry without having to pay for them? If I do, will it actually keep me dry? Maybe I can make the hairdresser the post office. All this kind of adaptive work is not done kind of theoretically. It's done in terms of what's possible on the ground. And, in a very vulnerable, and at the same time, once it attains a certain level of coherence or pride, should it look like what happened in Medellin with snappy architecture? Good question. I don't have a ready answer because you can see that people are proud of it. On the other hand, it does feel flown in, and it has a different register. And well, I will go on.
Yeah, I think I'd kind of engender a position that I think is part to do with those successes like the tectonics issue, and it sort of, I think this one of the keys is the question of difficulty and a kind of striving to reach a sort of conclusion. I mean, actually, the last time I'm reminded, being here, the last time I was in Belgrade, I was invited by the sculptor Richard Deacon to come to celebrate the opening of a bridge. That, the difficulty was a highway, and it was how to connect the castle with the river edge. And it's and it was a really difficult project. From funding, he worked closely with a sculptor, a colleague, no doubt of yours, whose name escapes me right now. But that question of form and the speculation that was involved in going simply from a high level to a low level in an extraordinarily interesting way, a bridge, a philosophical issue, and then a material solution, which I think is incredibly beautiful. So there's a sort of thematic that we could have been talking about, whether it was education, health. In this instance, it was a cultural bridging. It was an extraordinary sense of the place of this small project, in the city that had such a relevance. And so, yeah, I think what I conclude from that is the struggle with difficulty, rather than pressing the button, in terms of production, is the thing that is probably an essence that lies behind all these efforts, that I think is very profound and important. But anyway, it's lovely to be thrown back into that memory of Belgrade, which sort of came upon a much earlier one, which is this incredible sort of relationship between, Slovenia, the world of Ljubljana, traveling through the spine of this essential part of Europe, those Byzantine pilgrimage churches that turn suddenly into mosques as you get somewhere like Udine, or, it's the most incredible place, of riches culturally. So thank you. It's lovely to be here with you.
So we're coming perhaps to the end, are we?
Well, it's possibly a little bit like the end, but I also can't resist saying something in response a little bit, since you provoked the question of architectural education, and then sitting here, sort of going back through my past, I suppose, a little bit as well. Peter, I'm surprised no one picked you up on the provocation of sort of coffee and froth, but we can talk about that later. I think, but perhaps on...
Froth is more essential.
Perhaps on that note, it's extraordinary for me to be here. I think, Peter, I did 5 years of sitting in your office talking about pretty much everything, two dissertations, and I'm neither a philosopher nor a theorist. And I think I came at this like a child. I came at it through our conversations around Pasolini, around the nuances of socialites in Washington, D.C. We had many a very early morning tutorial before you got on the train to London around my projects. And I think in many ways, Eric, your work has always been a critical example for people like Peter and Dalrymple when he was around, as a way of talking about the ideas that were embedded within the teaching, within the studio projects. And it's important because the manifestation, I'm not going to use embodiment there, but and the materiality of the work that you've done has been very carefully rooted also in a very particular history. And I think this comes back to the question of the teaching of history. You talk about this as an academic journal, and the way in which we communicate amongst one another academically, in that we are in reference to others. And I think that so much of what I was taught, somehow by osmosis, and perhaps I learned something along the way, is, for instance, the 9 trips I did to Rome, I think the last of which you gave me an amazing sort of, I wouldn't call it a synopsis of the Baroque because it was lengthy, and that wove together a series of ideas that were then apparent in a city like Rome, that built over time, that told the story of a move from traditional culture to the modern in a way that I could then talk to first-year undergraduates about in a way that was meaningful. So this junction for me, call it philosophy, call it thinking, as a way of describing an idea, as a way of being an architect, is critical. I think we could go on all night about whether we call this philosophy or not. But I think that, so much of what is critical to teach students is a level of understanding how they can go about that thinking. And I am, again, neither a philosopher nor a theorist, but I always say to the first years, even here now, we can use architecture and our writing and our thinking to try and make sense of what is a very difficult and complex world. And that has become apparent in a variety of different ways. But the bottom line for me is probably that, which I don't know if that's the coffee or the froth, Peter, but there's a lot of density in there, perhaps in both senses. I think perhaps we can move to some more, if we could kind of carry the conversations through, if maybe one more question that would be great.
Let me just say quickly, one of the things that was interesting, Dalibor and I both taught in the studio and in the history and philosophy course, but the populations of each was pretty separate. I mean, there were very few people like us who did both.
That's very true. But they were, for the people that did both, indistinguishable. I mean, I think that those who were in the diploma units with you and with Dalibor were part of the back row of the MPhil seminars. There was a conversation that went on, and we didn't know there was a difference. We didn't know that those conversations weren't relevant to our studio work. They seemed completely obvious. And so when it came actually to teaching in Zurich at the ETH, where I had to remind a student that actually the lecture they'd just been to might be relevant to their project, I didn't know that wasn't the case. So I think perhaps, again, through a degree of ignorance, those relationships were obvious. And I'm sort of hoping they start to become more obvious here.
You mentioned about the inaccuracy in the use of words in architectural realm. So I'm wondering, I guess my question is the very fact that architecture is brought into this conversation in relation to philosophy is causing the problem of inaccuracy? So I sort of always feel that this tension between architecture and philosophy, that almost like if we have to enter the realm of discussion of architecture, the philosophy has to be kind of simplified in a way to kind of fit into the conversation. So, and also I guess another question is, so when does the thinking or the critical thinking action becomes philosophy? Is there a kind of line for that? If the kind of theories is what we're criticizing here?
I'd like to, okay, this is a little bit complicated now. I'd like, it's important here is to wake up a philosopher in architects. That's it. Philosophy could be good instrument. You can read in Vitruvius, he's not using theory, he's using philosophy. And it's important, just idea of this, we can say, the mission of this journal, when we are here in architectural department, is to push architects to thematize their work, to think, and to be philosopher. Let's say like this, embodiment of philosopher in architect. That's the deal.
That might be a good note on which to bring the event to go.
Thank you so much, Kenneth. Also, I know there are other questions, but perhaps you can rush the table and ask them more in a more relaxed setting.
I think a round of applause for the public.
Absolutely, well done.